and writer Noel Carroll, Doris Chase, Nuria Font, Amy Greenfield, Steve Jackman from The Place in London, Daniel Nalgren, mentioned Ami, Elaine Summers, Laura Toller, Sita Popat, Pooh-Kay, and others. And I'm sorry I can't name everyone. Sally Baines was here as well. The audience was filled with many of the people who have gone on to create important festivals, writing, and advocacy for the field. We fully intended to hold this event in 2020 to honor the 20th anniversary of the first Screen Dance Symposium. However, COVID made that impossible. So now we gather 2 years later, but perhaps with a more highly defined understanding of how important such moments are. Many of us and many of you have made such pilgrimages to similar events and festivals in this past 20 years. And here I'll note some events that perform a certain kind of intentionality for the field, an aspirational criticality that aims not only to delight sensorially via the public exhibition of screen dance, but that frame and contextualize such work within highly defined and rigorous conversations that elevate our understanding of the intersection of dance and media in the world. And I can't again name all of them. I apologize, as there's been so many important such gatherings in the last 20 plus years, but I'll name a few. And Sylvina Sperling was actually supposed to be here, but had a problem with her visa, so unfortunately she is not, and I think she's on Zoom. But Sylvina Sperling's Festival de Videodanza in Buenos Aires, the What If Festival in the UK, co-curated, and I hope I get all the names right, Claudia Koppenberg, Lucy Cash, Becky Edmonds, Kirsten White, and Gil Clark. Light Moves, organized by Mary Wycherley and Jürgen Simpson in Limerick, Ireland. Agutai Survey in Mexico, founded by Jimena Monroy and Paulina Rucarba. In June 2006 and June 2007, or rather November 2007, Simon Fildes, Carl J. Lewin, and Katrina McPherson initiated and co-hosted the open source Video Dance Symposia. And most recently, Regarde Breed, convened in Montreal by Priscilla Guy and Amélie Morin. There was an iteration of Screen Dance State of the Art that I curated at the American Dance Festival, Durham, North Carolina in 2006, and a slightly different iteration in 2009. I know some of you were at that, or one of those. And as I noted, I can't name all those events that have happened. However, what binds these particular activities together is that they represent a post-festival model that presents screen dance as an art form of consequence in a context that foregrounds similar critical measures found in the art world writ large. That's my opinion. We can talk about that more, I'm sure we will during the week. But this idea that we are an art form of consequence is at the heart of this. And we'll also hear about the Screen Dance Network and the founding of the International Journal of Screen Dance, as well at our first long table in a few moments. Perhaps the godmother of such archival curatorial events is Film Dance, 1890s to 1983 by Elaine Summers and Amy Greenfield, which occurred in New York in 1983 and lives on all these years later as a kind of talisman in the form of, quite literally, a little black book. Some of you may have a copy of this little black book. I think that its importance can't be overstressed. The Mexican poet Octavio Paz noted, quote, "What distinguishes modern art from the art of other ages is criticism." What distinguishes modern art from the art of other ages is criticism. And while he made that observation in the 1960s, it's been prescient for those of us who wish to see screen dance as a way to address the current condition, the condition of this historical moment, and to make meaningful, relevant, and articulate statements about the real bodies of real people whose commitment to real and authentic discourse through their creative process motivates a palpable sense of urgency. Criticality, as in deeply considered, intentional, and a part of a discourse that is larger than itself. A gestalt, if you will, made of a multiplicity of objects, films, literature, and more. We just had a conversation about this, and so many things came up about this moment and how we as sort of makers and advocates of screen dance are responding or can respond to those things. Much of the support for this symposium comes from the Virginia Horn Henry Fund on the UW-Madison campus, whose mandate is to help the School of Education and the University of Wisconsin-Madison develop a margin of excellence in women's physical education by creating a campus resource dedicated to the pursuit of women's lifelong learning skills in the areas of physical education, including knowledge and appreciation of women's movement and the female body in culture. I must also acknowledge the support of the Division of the Arts and Chris Walker as well, and the Departments of Art and Dance for their generous support. And I want to say a huge thank you to Kel Murr. Are you here, Kel? Right here. Can you raise your hand? Here. Who's responsible for all the graphic design, communication, and who's assisted me in all stages of planning. And I also want to say thanks to Aaron Granat, Aaron, who's documenting everything. He's doing a lot of things with cameras and stuff. But Aaron's a talented filmmaker who's documenting all of what goes on this week, and he's working today with his creative partner, who's also called Aaron. The symposium is one component at the heart of a few projects that are in the works. Connected to the symposium is a documentary project and an open source archive intended to support the ongoing histories of screen dance internationally. My original proposal to the Virginia Horn Henry Fund was focused on a project that would look closely at the feminist roots of screen dance. It was very narrowly defined. That first proposal was about 3 years ago. COVID came. We had to hold off, obviously. But that really is at the core of this endeavor. Screen dance is, I believe, deeply rooted in feminist art practices and in an earlier historical gaze that began with the earliest recordings of women dancing, often rendered by men. Artists and photographers such as Claude Cahun, Germaine Krull, and Lottie Jacobi, working in Europe in the early part of the 20th century, continually reclaimed that gaze in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, later Maya Deren famously articulated a new model of looking through her filmmaking and writing about the form. I want to take a minute to mention something that I just thought about while we were talking, so it's on my phone, I apologize. But women and marginalized groups, outsiders, so-called outsiders, all flow into spaces before gatekeepers have the opportunity to shut doors and deny access. Screen dance has been the beneficiary of such early adopters. I made my first dance for camera in around 1979 at a community college in California before I'd ever taken a dance class or knew how to make a film. Somebody mentioned earlier, maybe it was Katrina, having made your first few years of quote unquote screen dance work without ever having seen any screen dance work. Somehow we found our way into this form. It was a film, the film I made back in 1979 was never shown, nor should it have been shown. But it was a step before the next step, which of course is before the next step and the next step. It made me think about the possibilities of moving into a space where there was little history available to me, where there were no gatekeepers, essentially. I'd seen dance performances, I'd seen live work, I'd seen durational work, I'd seen feminist work by women and feminist performance work, happenings, all the things that were percolating up in California in that moment in time. So it wasn't much of a leap to think about stumbling my way through some sort of live or recorded, Super 8, in my case, experimental film without any prior knowledge. But the more we know, the more we know. And so this idea of gatekeeping may come up in other people's talks today, or it may come up in some sort of discussions, especially at the long table. But screen dance might be considered as one of the most fully formed movements of the 21st century. And at the core of this movement really is, I believe, the labor of women. My own practice across multiple disciplines is created in the space carved out by feminist artists that were, without a doubt, my guides, teachers, and mentors in the time I just mentioned and beyond. Some of them I've been lucky enough to meet, others I've learned from through their work, their writing, and if not for Maya Deren, Amy Greenfield, Elaine Summers, Doris Chase, Blondell Cummings, Meredith Monk, Yvonne Rainer, and so many others, I would quite literally not be standing here. And I am very conscious that I'm standing here in a field populated mostly by women. So I take that to heart. The liminal performative screen work of artists such as Joan Jonas, Hannah Wilke, Carolee Schneemann created radically new ways of thinking about the body and its screnic self. It was the work of such artists that I began to understand, through whom I began to understand what was possible when we think about art as an extension of the whole self, and to apply that mantra to representations of things that we feel deeply about, on screens, in the dark. That's my experience, on screens, in the dark. It was these artists, and of course others, theorists and writers like Laura Mulvey, who articulated the male gaze. Peggy Phelan's performance theory, Adrian Piper's performative media work addressing race and identity, and others, who made us look, and in that looking made us confront our own personhood, who subverted our biases, made us culpable and responsible to not just the image, but to the image in relation to history and to art writ large. And of course, made us choose whether we wanted to be part of what really was a kind of revolution, or whether we wanted to stay in the comfortable confines of the waning of formalism and the gendered structures of power. Screen dance is many things to many people, but to me, it holds the possibility to still be the most significant practice in this time in history. I've loved dance and I've loved film, but in the intersectionality of the two, I've been moved beyond measure. In works that stretch both the boundaries of movement and the screnic possibilities of the image, such works, older works perhaps, as La Chambre, the classic French cine dance by Joël Bouvier and Regis Obadia, with its nod towards surrealism and the presentness that pervades the black and white grainy surface, a film really shot on film that carried me along via the tension in the dancers' breath, the snapping of their dresses. I was swept away. I've been marked like Roland Barthes' idea of punctum and studium, attentive to the milieu of the image, but pierced by that which particularizes me and grabs my heart. That's Barthes' idea. I'm equally moved by other films and smaller moments inside of films like the scene in Bergman's Virgin Spring from 1960, in which Max von Sydow's character, in a fit of grief and rage, and with only his hands and body, wrestles a tall tree to the ground. Shot in one long take, from medium range in a bleak landscape, the humanness of this dance between person and tree ends with both falling to earth. I recall the first time I saw Victoria Mark's film Outside In, which celebrated diversity and disability by creating a space in which erotic play, sensuality, and imaginary landscapes all conspire to make me, the viewer, feel elated. The kiss that was passed along between those performers resonated deeply in the era of HIV/AIDS. I also recall a Super 8 film by Josh Bloom in which we see Sally Gross extending the ideas of the Judson Group, improvising and dancing on the streets of New York's Lower East Side in the mid-1980s, speaking in Yiddish, telling stories in her Mamaloshin, in her native tongue, reinscribing the histories of her own family onto the space of the neighborhood she grew up in, where her father sold fruits and vegetables. I felt the same sort of exhilaration recently watching a more recent film called Jonte by Siam Obregon and Kiana Lin, and performed by Jonta McCrory. It was screened at a number of places, but particularly for me, it was screened at In Shadow in Lisbon, where I was a member of the jury that awarded the festival's top prize. Jonte, the film, is a personal evocation of exactly this moment. The rage, the anger, the emotional tone are all of a piece that makes one attentive from the very start of the film. The voices of co-directors Siam Obregon and Kiana Lin are evident throughout. This is an auteurs film, if those auteurs were feminist activists for social justice as well as sensitive filmmakers. As both, the film allows its performer, Jonte McCrory, to fill the frame with the rage of his own internal narrative and raw power, a presence that is deeply moving. Thinking curatorially, it is, as a film made within the historical moment, related to Amy Greenfield's Transport of 1970, made in the midst of the horrors of the Vietnam War, an elegy to the brutality and senselessness of that moment. performed as if the lives of its dancers were in some way hanging in the balance. I think about the stark clarity of Douglas Wright's film called Elegy from 1992, that at the outset dedicated itself to men who have died of HIV/AIDS, a searing work that addresses homophobia and the hysteria surrounding queer bodies that had so gripped the culture at the time. I also think of Bill T. Jones' film called Untitled, in which he reanimates his partner Arnie Zane, already dead from HIV/AIDS in 1988, and speaks directly to him, to Arnie, on screen, dancing for the camera and for Arnie at the same time. Many of these films seem technically distant, their surface quality softer and more raw than what we are accustomed to at this moment. Yet they haunt us and speak to, again, the possibility of screen dance to embody trauma and authenticity, and to be a space of aspiration, to be socially conscious, and to make us look and feel. Many such works have pierced me through the heart, as Barth has described, as the punctum, or the power of images speak directly to me, the viewer. We, the collective audience, know in this moment, or in moments like this, that screen dance can offer us the privilege of bearing witness, of being present in a way that allows us to be aspirational, and to imagine that this work can indeed make a difference. The model of feminist curating is curating as manifesto making. All works of art are manifestos, or should be, I believe. Jury awards, prizes, etc., without criteria, critical analysis, or public statement, does not contribute to a greater understanding of the gestalt or aggregate of a group of screen dance works. As a remedy, I would suggest modeling feminist curating as in the larger art world, as we enter, again, what I would describe as this post-festival model. So art historian Angela Dimitrikaki has proposed a model of curatorial work whereby the curatorial gesture is concerned with histories to come rather than just exploring or only exploring those already in place. So histories to come rather than exploring those already in place. That don't, quote, just belong to a feminist past, but, quote, could be deployed in the context of strategic thinking about the present and future of feminism in the arts. The art historian, curator, and writer Amelia Jones refers to, quote, using curating to make a political and historical proportions about feminist legacies, sort of upscale those feminist ideas. While both quotes specifically speak about strategies that support feminism, similar strategies can be deployed in the service of screen dance, and I know they are being, so forgive my manifesto-like tone here. Feminist curating in the 1970s forward describes a kind of activist model that pushes the discourse toward a rigorous analytical framework, and also steers artists toward applying such strategies in the creation of work that matters both historically and in the present. In other words, the prize for making work that attracts critical and serious attention is not a prize, but actual change to the field, to the audience who views the work, and to the archive. It's not a prize, actually. It's actual change to the field. That's what I'm proposing is kind of the aspirational piece there. This model requires the work of curation to return to the text, to go out on a limb and tell the viewer why they should care, the root of curate, to care about the work, and how such caring, perhaps as opposed to liking or enjoying, leads to illumination, to a deeper understanding of the artist's intentions, and ultimately offers a path of entry to larger conversations put forward by the work itself. It's a kind of synergistic ecology in which the curator, artist, institution works collaboratively toward a field that is truly inclusive and mindful of the field of screen dance, its sustainability, its histories. It really is a model that's not dissimilar to the film festivals such as Cinema 16 in New York, or equivalents in the 60s and 70s in cities around the world, and to certainly some of the festivals that we've all been to currently. In asking more from curators, from festivals, from makers and audiences, we all benefit. The ideals we hold to be of value are given form as the issues we seek to introduce into the milieu of our work. I think it's important to recall that in the historical avant-garde, screen dance offered a kind of resistance to the status quo of both dance and film. And we touched on that in the discussion this morning, I think, too. In a field such as screen dance, in which there's no real center, especially in regard to the kind of centralized power that we can recognize in other fields, how we deploy screen dance and its ephemera is central to much of the conversation I imagine we'll have this week. So how does power accrue in already marginal fields? And what do we do with that power, however minimal it may be? How do we leverage our resources? And I raise those questions somewhat rhetorically, but I had the opportunity to engage in a number of related conversations with members of the International Screen Dance Journal editorial board during the last few years that focused on how we might think or rethink the distribution of power and resources through the journal, through our practices as editors in the journal itself. Decolonization came up a number of times, both generally and specifically. What needs to be done, and what can we do in screen dance institutions to make our spaces and practices more just? And what are the actual gestures of decolonization that we can achieve? With those thoughts still fresh in my mind, I attended an event at Tangente in Montreal before COVID. Claudia Koppenberg was there, and others that framed some of these same ideas in a way that helped me to clarify where I fit into such discussions. That experience at Regardie Breed, curated by Priscilla Guy and Amélie Morin, led to an essay that I'll briefly quote here, and then I'll be finishing pretty quickly here. And so this is from the essay that I wrote about that. And I recalled that, quote, while in Montreal recently, I had the opportunity to see and experience a profoundly moving video installation at Musée Contemporain by the artist Francis Alix. Alix's work is poetic, political, and often addresses his own quotidian observations of everyday life through performance, sculpture, and installation. He describes his practice as a, quote, sort of discursive argument composed of episodes, metaphors, or parables, end quote. In children's games, the multi-screen installation at the museum that we attended, Alix arrays almost 20 individual films shot and collected since 1999 onto a porous tapestry of childhood activities. And I would note that they're all kind of about movement, right? They're all about children in motion playing in places around the world, usually places of poverty. These simple films collectively illuminated the ways in which mostly impoverished children turn everyday objects such as plastic bottles, flying insects, chairs, coins, stones into games and a sort of interactive universe. What was evident in all these films was the idea of improvisation and of giving space to one's collaborators in order to create a collective sense of freedom and joy. While wandering through the cinematic landscape created by the work of Alix, I began thinking about how we are taught, or instinctively learn, or not perhaps, to take turns and to give space to others so that they may experience something joyful or new in their lives. As artists, we compete throughout our careers for shows, for space in shows, for reviews, for teaching positions, for performance opportunities and grants, and for gigs of all kinds. It becomes rote, this competition for space, for a platform from which to speak. However, space, like land, is limited and needs to be tended. And while it seems there should be enough for everyone, the idea of taking turns or sharing such space has gotten lost in the metaphoric sense and in reality as well. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to share one's resources, to really share space and things and platforms and opportunities, to be generous in a way that's neither done for one's own edification or attention or for personal gain, but simply as a gesture of recognition to others, a recognition of others. I've been thinking about what it means to be an ally in the arts and beyond, and how to do so generously and with an open heart. Advocating for those other than oneself inherently means that an opportunity for visibility may confer to the one we advocate for, or rather than being sort of something that accrues to ourselves. And this seems to be a foundational and very real fact of generosity. I've been noticing more and more that spaces in which I regularly participate, conferences, publishing, symposia, other spaces, public exhibitions where knowledge is creative capital, also undergoes a kind of sharing practice. that brings a kind of new and different dynamic to those spaces. Simply put, many of these spaces have become sensitive to the changes in social and cultural norms, some have not, and those spaces lean more toward inclusivity, toward polyvocality, toward diversity. They've become aspirational spaces in which one can feel the pendulum swing of a process of repair and righteousness, where discussions of privilege and otherness are brought from the margins to the center. I recently had that opportunity at Regard Hybrid, which I mentioned earlier, in a space that felt charged and particularly contemporary and thoughtful. Contemporary dance artist Kim San Chow describes the organizing principle of the festival as, quote, definitely engaged in a feminist curation, which by extension involves BIPOC and queer artists, end quote, which she notes, quote, is not unusual in the screen dance world, end quote. However, such a gesture is perhaps signaling a significant change in the landscape of the field. Since attending Regard Hybrid, I've been thinking about a generational shift in the field and the possibility for a kind of, and here I'm using quotes, a kind of allyhood. And I'm using quotes particularly purposefully, but the possibility of a kind of allyhood in support of an inclusive screen dance community. The curatorial imprimatur at Regard Hybrid was decidedly feminist, of color, and queer. And though an empathetic ally, I'm none of the above. And I wondered, can I speak? May I speak here? If I do, whose space do I impose on? And of what value is my voice in this discussion? For the most part, I tried to listen and to feel what it was like to not be in the center, but at the margins, a visitor in a space that was empowering others by intention, and to be conscious of the moment and the amount of space that I take up, generally. Clearly, we are well into a moment in which many of us, myself included, and I'm really talking about myself here, need to lean out so others can lean in. This means not only being an ally, but advocating strongly for spaces that are inclusive and empowering, consciously recognizing issues of gender and sexuality, marginalized identities, and LGBTQ+ challenges. In one of the seminars, again speaking of Regard Hybrid, in one of the seminars, film theorist Alana Thane wondered aloud, quote, why don't we reconceive the histories of cinema as the history of screen dance, end quote. A proposal which I thought about a lot, and I thought, why not? In our subsequent conversation, Thane suggested a number of ideas that both validated some of my own observations and challenged me to move beyond my own limitations or boundaries in thinking about difference and community. She talked about the idea of, quote, redistributing vulnerability, end quote, around such fraught issues as race and gender in screen dance and elsewhere, which I understood as a kind of communal embodiment of the anxiety around such conversations. She suggested that within, quote, intergenerational conversations, end quote, we might find generational allyhood and new kinds of professional practices leading to a model of what she called civic engagement. So it's in the same spirit that this symposium moved forward. In the almost 2 years that have passed since Regard Hybrid, its importance resonates even more deeply with me personally. As our screens become overly populated with creative applications of streaming media, much of it making use of familiar arts-based techniques, which Professor Thane also calls platform determinism, which I am adopting, but citing, it is tempting to frame some of it as screen dance. As makers and thinkers, we have a very full toolkit with which to critically engage mediated images of all kinds, from creation to distribution to analysis. And how we deploy these tools is what grants the screen dance community a kind of global and artistic citizenship, and likewise the responsibilities that come with it in the shifting landscapes of the cultures in which we live. And at the core of such citizenship, I would suggest, is a kind of service to the field. That is really how screen dance has been built outward from small communities of artists and thinkers. Built into that service is always the question of how this works and how we speak to ambition beyond our own practice. I mentioned earlier an idea that suggested that every work of art is a manifesto, and I think that can be applied to most of what we do. How do we want this work to land? To whom are we speaking and why? And how can this work change the field, change the world, and make a contribution beyond what might accrue to me? With these thoughts in mind, I want to say how grateful I am that you are all here taking part in the 2022 International Screen Dance Symposium. And again, I want to thank everyone who has and will contribute to this really important gathering of our community.